I'm going to get off the stage here and welcome our two conversants tonight. Please welcome to the stage former chair of the board, current board member and lady about town extraordinaire, Liz Crocker, and of course the lady we're all here to see, former Live at 5 anchor, host of the Soul Booth, and now published author, Nancy Regan. Great big hand, please.
I'm not allowed to talk yet because she's going to introduce me.
And isn't she really well behaved?
No, never.
So here we are. Hi, Liz. How are you?
Hi, everybody.
And I'm just going to let you know right away that if you've seen this book, so you all know it's Nancy Regan. We're here for this book, right? You're not here to see Lady Gaga. No mistakes, right?
This is not church tonight.
No. So, you know, how do you introduce Nancy Regan? I mean, some people think that they know you because they've seen you on the news and they've seen you doing events and so on and so forth. But when you read this book, you'll know that there's much more to Nancy Regan to know. And I'm just kind of riffing on this. When I set up these in conversations, I talk to the person I'm going to talk to beforehand. I had set aside half an hour to talk to Nancy, and really, I kid you not, 2 hours later, I was saying, "Hey, soul sister," like, you know, we were just so.
It was like that too. It wasn't a long 2 hours. It was like it passed like that.
And so, if you see Andrew waving at me at some point, it's his letting me know that at some point we have to stop talking and let you ask questions. But the first thing I want to draw your attention to is on this cover, you'll notice Nancy's wearing Converse sneakers. And I told her I was so glad she's wearing them tonight because it's not just accidental, is it?
No.
Talk about your sneakers.
It's so much. Hi, everybody. I'm Nancy. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. My Converse on the cover are very intentional. One reason is that it's about, the book is very much about getting back to who I was before the world told me who to be and how to be. And I was what was called in those days a tomboy. You couldn't get away with using that phrase anymore. And even being called a tomboy sort of communicated to me that there was something a little wrong with me, and yet at the same time I think I felt very proud to be a tomboy. So the sneakers are partly because of that, and partly because, and this is an indication of my word fetish and how much I love word play, but I really want to converse with my audience, with my readers. I wanted to create a conversation. So I know it's corny, but it's also heartfelt. And the book is pretty vulnerable and very open. And that's not because I wanted to overshare. In fact, it was counterintuitive. It's not the book that I pitched to Nimbus, but they dragged it out of me. And I have to say that the whole point of it is to have people read it and say, "Oh, I'm not alone," or "She feels like that. Oh, it makes sense that I would feel that." Especially, you know, I talk about some of my challenges in life and traumas, and I say clearly to the reader that it's very likely, you know, I've led a privileged life in so many ways, and it's very likely if these are the stones in my path, you've had boulders or worse. And no wonder, you know, if I can feel this way, feel like an imposter and fall into terrible perfectionism and fear of making mistakes and fear of being seen as inadequate, which of course is, if you dig beneath that, it's the fear and the limiting self-beliefs that I am inadequate. And that's what this book was about, digging into all of that. And it's meant to be helpful.
And it is, I take my word for it, or buy the book yourself, but, you know, Nancy says early on in the book that her life looked like it was perfect. She had a lovely family and a fabulous job. You were hired at age 22 to do this job, which is amazing, and you stayed at it for 30, or
Wait a second.
no, sorry, 15 years. Yes, I was doing the math wrong. So everything to the outside people looked perfect, but you say it was all false.
Well, it wasn't all false, but what I do say in part of the book is, you know, I had the perfect marriage. I was the perfectly happy mother. I was, you know, I had the best job in the world, and that was by design that it looked like that, because that's what my mask was geared toward, creating that illusion. And I'm not alone in that. As we all know, you know, all you have to do is look at social media today, and you can see what I call the mask, which is, I'll let you see so much, and I think it's transparent. When I look back at my younger self and see myself on television, of course you can do that. When you've worked on TV for 15 years, there's lots of evidence of how you were showing off or showing up. And I can look at myself now and say, oh yeah, so I was allowing myself to be seen to a degree, but I was only showing the parts that I thought were worthy of approval. And I didn't want anyone to know about the parts of me that I didn't approve of. And you know, it's like Carl Jung's shadow work. I feel when I coach people in public speaking, I always say that the fear of public speaking, I believe, is really the fear of public being. And beneath that is the fear of being seen. And beneath that, the fear of being seen as being inadequate. And as I said about myself earlier, if you dig deeper than that with people, it's usually the fear that they are inadequate and they don't want anyone to know. And that was absolutely my story. And yet I was wearing the mask to convince, you know, I have a lot of people who've said, both reading this book and in the years past, since I was 22 starting on TV, oh, you're the most confident person I know. And if I'd ever say something about being nervous, they'd say, oh, come on, you're the most confident person. And even if I'd say, no, I'm not. And I remember having a conversation with my parents at one point as a probably 45-year-old saying something about, you know, lacking in confidence, and that's ridiculous. They both were really not prepared to accept that. And I know, you know, what the true story was, but we often, in my experience, we wear the masks in many realms of our life. And for me, it wasn't just a professional mask that I wore to be on TV. It was, I didn't want people to know when I was in my first marriage that it wasn't perfectly happy. We had a perfect house. We had seemingly perfect children. But that was terrifying. In fact, I tell the story in the book of being at an event at the Women's Council House. Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Yeah, on the corner of Yonge Avenue. And it was a tea for Dress for Success charity. And it was a lot of women dressed to the nines in what I consider their, you know, suits of armor. Everything was perfect. And a friend of mine, there were several friends there, and this gal that I'd been spending quite a bit of time with in this small group of women was there. And someone said, well, why don't we go out after this tea and go do something together? And she said, her name is Sandy, and she said, no, you know, I'm really having a lot of trouble in my marriage right now, and I think I just need to go home. I just need to be at home and settle in there and address things that need to be addressed, and I don't feel like I'm anxious to be out in public right now. And it was like she could have pushed me over with a feather, because we didn't have the kind of relationship, even amongst the group of friends that I'm talking about, where we would have that kind of dialogue, that very real dialogue. And I just remember going, holy, I didn't know you could say that. Also within earshot of other people. And I was, so concerned about helping people believe that everything was great, that was a shock to my system. And she has been someone who has shone a flashlight on a path several times in my life, where it's like someone can shine a light on a path and you go, oh, there's a path there. And that, for me, that was that moment when she spoke that openly about not being happy. And I was in a stage in my life, you're not going to get to ask many questions if I talk this much. I was at a stage in my life where I was struggling with mood, with anxiety for sure, because of that internal critic just chattering away in my head all the time, whether I was on TV or not. And also mild depression, I would say, looking back at it now, although I would not have claimed that title because I would have compared myself to others and not felt that I deserved it. So, there. So that was a long answer.
No, but this is what you can see while we talk for 2 hours. So 2 things that have just come out of what you said. Number one, you mentioned Sandy, and I do remember that story in the book. But throughout the book, there are many people, famous or otherwise, at many times, who seem to either have that flashlight or just a little nudge. So can you talk about some of them? And if you miss any that I want you to talk about, I'll ask you to talk about them.
Well, the first one that comes to mind sounds like name dropping, but it's a pretty powerful one, and it's Oprah.
Yes, she was on my list.
Yeah, because
I've been hugged by Oprah.
stop. I don't know. That's a good question. I don't think she hugged me. I was on her set.
Okay,
interviewing
comparison
her.
and judgment is the next thing coming up.
Yeah. I don't feel like I missed out. I'm pretty happy to have had the opportunity to sit with her on a couch on her set and interview her. But she did say something in that conversation that I have thought about pretty well every day since. And that was I think that was in 1996 or something. So that's pretty impactful. And it was because I was asking her about her money. And I said, I know, you come from a very challenging childhood. You had a lot of difficulty in financial issues, scarcity, and so on. Do you ever feel guilty about having as much money as you have? And she said, hell no, Nance. She kept calling me Nance, which was really hilarious. It cracked me up, it still does. And she said, I never understood that. Like, if you really work and you earned the money, why would you feel guilty about that? And then she said, I do believe that you can have too much stuff. And she said, I'm at that point. And then she goes on and she's talking about the fact that she has too many shoes. And she said, I have a shoe sale twice a year at Harpo where I bring in all, probably hundreds of pairs of shoes. And I said, what size are your feet? And she said, size 10, Nance. And she said, but there are women with size 7 feet trying to stuff Kleenex in those shoes or wearing the... But she said, I'm over the stage where I, want stuff. She said, I do believe that from those to whom much is given, much is expected. And I didn't know at the time that was a biblical reference, but sometimes someone can utter words and they land inside you. And for me, that was a moment that made a difference in my life, because it was also planting a seed for a mindset that I have really. I was just saying to Liz, everything comes down to this for me. From showing off to showing up is, in my mind, showing off is living your life according to external references, other people's approval, judgment, praise, seeking approval, that sort of thing. Showing up is, here I am, this is me. And it's okay if I'm not for you. and actually putting a book out like this, you have to be in that mindset, because there are going to be, no book is for everyone.
Tell them what the opening line is.
It's the opening line is, you may hate this book, and it's possibility and permission. And I say that the possibility of your disdain is what gives the book wings, because I was always looking for gold stars for so long. So all that to say, from showing off to showing up, for me, when I coach clients, but also walking through the world, I'm seeing this all the time. If you're in a mindset of performance when you get up on stage, or when you go to a cocktail party, or when you go into a job interview, whatever it is, if you're in a mindset of performance, you're thinking about how you're being judged, how you're being seen. If you're in a mindset of contribution, you're thinking about what you're giving, what you have to share. And when I boil it down in my life, that's actually, for me, I'm living right now, I'm really trying to stay rooted in a sense of contribution rather than performance. And I was in performance for a long time, so I'm over that. And the way I thought about it, I just said this to James Mullinger today, because I was interviewing him. James Mullinger is a British comedian who is living in St. John, New Brunswick, and he has become the best flag waver for New Brunswick and for the Maritimes. He's also the editor and publisher of Edit magazine, which celebrates the Maritimes. Anyway, he interviewed me on his podcast, Mullinger Meets Canadians, and I interviewed him today for the Canadian Love Map, which I host. And as I said to him in response to something he said, I said, just the other day, I realized, for so long I was focused on being loved, wanting to be loved. And now it's about being love. I want to be in a sense of contribution. I want to be of service. I have friends who have told me over the years that when they wake up first thing in the morning, and I'm thinking of Anne Bérubé, who's an author, and David McGinley, who's a brilliant cancer chaplain in Halifax, who has a beautiful book called Beyond Surviving. And I asked, what's the first thing you think in the morning when you wake up? And one of them said, how may I be of service today? And the other said, Dave McGinley said, love through me. So he's a Lutheran minister who's not a practicing minister, but he is in a ministry helping people through the cancer journey, either to recovery or to their departure. And he's making such an important, meaningful contribution to the world. Anyway, so yeah, so it's showing off is love me, and showing up is I'm just here to be love and see how I can, in a small, maybe tiny way, make the world a better place today.
So you mentioned Oprah. I actually made a list of all the people that you mentioned. So no, but just because I think when we talked, I said all the books that you mentioned, I look in my studio and they are on my shelf. So this is why we just kind of resonated right away. But one of the people you mentioned is Brene Brown, and you just talked about you want to do love, and I see or saw in the book that your mantra is, I'll make sure I quote it right, find joy, stay safe, be love. But you also mentioned Brene Brown's mantra, which is strong back, soft front, wild heart.
Every time she says that, it makes truth bumps go through me.
Yeah.
Actually, it's funny because my mantra used to be something I started saying to my kids. So I'm very fear-based naturally, and I've always been terrified of my kids getting hurt or killed. And there's a reason for that, which you will learn if you read the book. But in my dig, I figured out why. But even once I was really trying to let go of that, envisioning what was going to be going wrong when they left the house, and you know, would they come back and all of that. I started to say to them, I have two older boys who are in their 20s and a daughter who's a teenager, and I would say, have fun, stay safe, be loved. And so, but it was still sort of in that fear-based system, because it was really about staying safe. You know, I do want them to have fun, but I want them to stay safe, and I want them to be loved. Now, during the pandemic, I couldn't really say that, because have fun didn't seem possible. And when 2020 hit, I was locked down on the South Shore at my cottage with my elderly mom and my daughter, and I was in a fear vortex. Like I felt like I was feeling the pain of the world. I was terrified. I knew I was safe, but I was feeling everybody else's fear and just so, you know, uncertain about what was going to happen, as I think most of us were. And so that's when I thought, okay, I can't have fun. And it became find joy. We can always find joy, I think. Even in pretty dark times, you can find some kind of sliver of joy. And stay safe is more now about boundaries and holding your own boundaries. If you notice, my body language is very open here, but I've got the boundary of the chair, which is personal. So it's about, you know, being open, but also knowing that I have the ability and the necessity to hold my own boundaries.
So I feel like I'm going to be a doom girl now, because I'm going to go from joy and go back to pain, because you wrote this book because you have been, maybe still are, on a journey through your past and into a tunnel and finding light. And one of the things that Nancy includes in her book is a whole bunch of poetry that she's written, but she also includes a lot of quotes from people that resonate with me, one of whom is Rumi. And one of the quotes of Rumi is, "These pains you feel are messengers. Listen to them." So if you would, go back to, you were having messengers. And I know from reading the book, at some point in time you ended up in a therapist's office, but between the messengers and ending up in a therapist's office, were there other nudges along the way?
Yeah, I think so. And I have to mention that Liz wrote a book, as many of you may know, called Transforming Memories. And she gave it to me several years ago. And I was in a busy stage then, and I always had it sitting there, and I meant to read it, and yet I believe that books, I've told many people who've said, "Oh, I haven't read your book yet," and I'm like, I believe you come to a book when you're meant to. And it's, for me, it's always been the perfect timing. When I read a book, it's like, oh my gosh, if I had read this a year earlier, it wouldn't be so impactful. And I read her book after I handed mine in, and I started to laugh, and I was like, oh my gosh, it might have helped me if I'd read it earlier, because I basically did what your process, your prescription was to, dig into those messengers. If there are things that are not going well, you need to figure out. But so often we like to just medicate ourselves, and I've done that too. Where you're with friends and it's easier to have a glass of wine and then have a more open conversation. And I think of that now as medicating. Now, don't get me wrong, I haven't stopped drinking altogether, although I'm flirting with the idea. Champagne is a problem for me, because last week I thought, I'm not going to drink anymore. And then someone offered me a glass of Prosecco on the weekend, and I said, sure, but I just stopped drinking the other day. Anyway, but I want to say that your book is all about digging into our shadow elements. And for me, I was not happy in my life, and I left my first marriage, and I thought, this will solve the problem. And I got married again, and I thought, oh, this is my soulmate. This will solve my lack of contentedness in my life. And of course, eventually I realized, no, it's me that I've got to look into. And I had to figure out what it was I didn't like about myself. And because that, I think, is why so many of us are uncomfortable on stage, because if you don't really like yourself, it's a bridge too far to just be yourself, as people say. You know, that's the most common piece of advice. Just be yourself. But if there are things about yourself you don't like, you don't want to just be yourself. And that was the situation for me. And so I realized over time that I really needed to figure out what it was I didn't like about myself. And that took, you know, going on retreats and doing some therapy. I've had limited exposure to therapy in my life. Embodied emotion, the process that Anne Berube does, which is really about breathing through old wounds, has been really incredibly helpful in my life. But this book has been the best therapy I could ever have, because having to go through the process, and I alluded to this earlier, but the book I pitched to Nimbus was a book about the fear of public speaking, which is kind of a business book. It's what I do, you know, with clients. And they said, yeah, sounds great. They liked my pitch, and I'm subversively soulful when I work with people, because I do believe I can give you tips and tricks, but unless you address the stuff going on down here, you're never going to be really comfortable on stage. And when you do, you can really learn to shine, partly because you allow yourself to shine, and partly because it's not shining in a way that is going to detract from others. You know, it's shining so that you're shining and hoping other people shine too. One of the things I love right now is that I've gone from being someone who's quite jealous and envious in my younger years to someone who loves to support other women, especially, and see and celebrate the light in other people, because I feel my own light now. And that's very different. Showing off is wanting people to see your light, like, look at me, but not really feeling it and needing that, you know, positive feedback that comes back at you in order to light you up. I had lots of that. I literally stood in a spotlight most of my career, and it couldn't light me up, as I say in the book, because that was unsustainable. As soon as I'd be out of the spotlight, I would, you know, feel my lack, my sense of lack. And so, yeah, my journey has been to moving past that sense of disconnection into a sense of connection with myself, and that has given me amazing connection to others. My relationships are so different than they were, you know, in my 20s and 30s, and even in my 40s.
And I was intrigued at one point in the book, you just mentioned Anne Berube, who wrote a wonderful book titled
Be, Feel,
Be,
Think,
Feel,
Do.
Think, Do.
Yeah, sorry.
Because we usually do think, feel, be, but she turns it around. But she started to work with Wayne Dyer and organize his tours, and you were brought on to help navigate that tour. And Nancy describes this in the book, and there's a provocative question that is asked, which is, who are you? Do you want to talk about that?
Oh,
question?
that was in one of Anne's retreats.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually it's an interesting exercise that she was doing. So you would be in pairs, and you would ask each other the question. There was a questioner and an answer, and you didn't answer loud, you just wrote down your answer. So if we were doing it together, I would say, who are you? Who are you, Liz?
And I'm supposed to write something
Yeah, and
down?
you write something each time I say it.
Right.
And I'd say, you know, I'd repeat it. And you go down about 15 times or 20 times. And it's instructive because when before we did the exercise, she pointed out that most people go immediately to their roles. I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm a broadcaster, I'm an author. But those are just roles that I play. And so when you have to dig beneath that, it's actually a really, I challenge you, if you feel like it, to go home and just do it for yourself and say, okay, who am I? And then keep digging into who you are in your essence. And
can you remember when you were doing that exercise, the kinds of things you wrote down, and do you think you would write different things down today?
No, I think actually, I like that question, but I think that by that time I was sort of coming to this idea that, oh, we are meant to be here to be love. And I think that's maybe where that expression that I started with the kids came out of that.
Right.
They have fun, stay safe, be love.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah.
Another person you talk about in the book who had impact on you is Elizabeth Gilbert.
Oh, yeah.
And some of you may recognize that name as the author of Eat, Pray, Love, and more recently a book called The Big Magic.
Big Magic is one of my favorite books. It's about creativity. It's a work of nonfiction.
But Elizabeth Gilbert came up here, and she was going to do a big public event, so you got to hang with her.
Yeah, actually, I went to New York to interview her, and so the fall was when she came up to do the show that my friends were producing, and I went down to Manhattan to do an interview for my podcast, The Soul Booth, with her. And friends lent me their flat there, which was fabulous, on the Upper East Side, and we had Liz come in. Anne went with me to shoot the video, and it was really interesting because before I went, I was doing a spin class at Dowplex, and I remember saying to a couple of women who we were just chatting after the class, and they were both a little older than me, and they said, "Oh, so what are you going to do in New York? You're going to New York, that's great." And I said, "Oh, I'm going to interview the author Elizabeth Gilbert." And one of them said, I think I might have said, she's the author of Eat, Pray, Love. And they had such diametrically opposed reactions. It was really pretty funny. It was very polarized. One of them said, "Oh my gosh, that book, I hated that book. It was so narcissistic. It was just so, her navel gazing, da 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 da." And the other woman said, "Oh, that's so interesting. That book changed my life a little bit because of how open and vulnerable she was willing to be." And that's the impact it had on me, because as with Sandy, in that story I talked about, I remember reading Elizabeth Gilbert's description of being in full depression with her face on the cold tiles of her bathroom floor and just sobbing and not knowing a way out of a marriage she was unhappy in and so on. And I was like, what? You can say this in the world? And as it turned out, when we were in our conversation, she did joke. She said, had I known how many millions of people were going to read it, I might not have been that open. I might have been a little less authentic. But that's why I think it resonated with so many people around the world, because people had that, "Oh, I'm not alone" reaction.
Yeah, I think she says if she had a wish, it would be to issue permission slips to everybody for everything. Mm-hmm. Even if it's staying in bed all day and crying on your pillow, just.
Yeah.
But she also introduced you, I think, to the concept of paradox.
Yes, and I want to say this takes me back to Wayne Dyer for a moment, because when I worked with Wayne, do you know who Wayne Dyer is? Some people only know him used to know him as the bald guy on PBS, because he was such a huge selling author and teacher that when they did telethons, they would use his show, and do little breaks where they would raise money. But he wrote about 50 books, and he left the planet. He passed away about 3 months after I worked with him on our maritime or Eastern Canadian tour, Montreal, Moncton. And Wayne, I remember him saying when Anne and I had dinner with him in Maui, he said, you know, people would have come to many shows, but then they'd be at maybe their 5th show and they might hear him say something and say, oh, you said that tonight. I've never heard of that or never thought about that. And he said, you know, I'd said that at every show. But you have to hear it in a certain way sometimes for the penny to drop. And that's what it was like for me with Liz Gilbert talking about paradox, because she had just recently lost about a year before, her partner Rhea Elias, who was a force of nature and a rock star, literally. But she was also a former heroin addict. And Liz had fallen in love with a man at the end of Eat, Pray, Love, a Brazilian man, and married him. And things had been going along pretty well. And Rhea was their third wheel. She was their, like, Liz's person. She was, you know, best friend. And the moment that Rhea told Liz that she had been given a diagnosis of stage 4 terminal cancer, penny dropped for Liz, and she right away said, I'm in love with this woman and I need to be honest. I can't imagine watching her die and not being honest about my feelings. And maybe she'll say, back off there, sister. She had seen her do that with other women who declared their love for her. But of course it was mutual. And anyway, so Liz saw her out, really helped her in her dying process. And along with Rhea's two former girlfriends, actually, the 3 of them really formed a nest and worked together to allow her to die at home. But in our conversation, Liz said, so was I the most compassionate, giving, selfless caregiver, or was I a total effing narcissist caught in my own shit? Yes. Yes. She said yes, and that's my answer to most things, yes. Both were true. And something about that flipped a switch in me a little bit. She also talked about showing compassion to herself. And she talked, I mean, this rang a bell for me because she said, you know, my mission now is to be love in the room. In any room I walk into, I'm just meant to be love in the room. And she said, and if I'm by myself in the room, then I'm the one I'm supposed to be loving. And I was like, ooh. Self-love was a really abhorrent phrase to me for a long time. Like, I just felt it made me, ugh. And now I realize, because I was in self-loathing. It was like the directions they give you in Maine when you stop and they're too complicated, they'll just say you can't get there from here. And that's kind of how I felt. So she flipped the switch for me by the way in which she looked at paradox, and it changed my own level of self-acceptance. And that was paired with Wayne Dyer's message of, we are all light. Like, we're all, you know, light. We just forget that we are light. And whether you think of that as divinity, pieces of the divine, or just in terms of an imagery, I see myself, as I was driving home from Wayne's Moncton show, I was like, oh my gosh, I have been on a dimmer switch my whole life. And I you know, remind you, any toddlers you've seen, you just have to think about, you know, seeing a toddler whirl around an airport and their parents trying to control them. They're full of their own light. They don't care what other people think, how they're being judged, anything. And yet the world tells us, behave, be good, be quiet, and never just be, as in Anne's be, feel, think, do, just be who you are. And there are reasons for that, you know, our parents are trying to protect us and help us fit in and so on. But when I was driving home from Wayne's night in Moncton, I realized, I thought about the dimmer switch in our house growing up. In our living room, we had this dial, and you could turn it down all the way and then it would click off. And yet you could turn it all the way and not click it off, but the lights looked like they were out. And I remember being kind of fascinated by that as a kid. And that came rushing back to me, and I was like, oh, I have had my dimmer switch turned down for most of my life, you know, since I was a teenager for sure. And I'm maybe a slow learner. It took me 50 years to get around to realizing there was a light there. And I think that's what I'm hearing from people who are reading my book, which is really gratifying, is I'm not the only one. Like, people are like, yeah, that's my experience. And they're thinking about when did that light go out? When did it get turned all the way down? What was it that turned it all the way down? How did I contribute to it being turned down in my own life, and so on? And anyway, I think I believe we're all called to figure out how to turn up our own dimmer switch, and then to do it for other people.
Well, and also how to like and embrace the parts of us that we might think other people would judge as an impairment, right?
Right.
So, and I think you, because of your love of language, you play with the words flawed and fraud.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I say we're all either flawed or fraud. If we're not willing to admit we're flawed, we're fraud.
Yeah. Well, you know, flawed.
Flawed. Hello.
And for me, one of the, you know, maybe I'm the oldest person in the room, I'm not sure. But one of the joys of getting older is I don't care so much.
High five on that. Oh, distance high five.
Yeah, exactly.
Virtual high five.
Yeah. So just jumping from the paradox and that you can be fabulous and flawed at the same time, Nancy also mentions in her book a man by the name of Paul Luftenegger, who I understand is well known outside of Canada. He's a conscious musician, and he's written a song inspired, I think, by this whole conversation about paradox.
By the conversation with Liz Gilbert. Yeah.
Called Broken and Whole. And I encourage you to go home and look it up and listen to it. The music is beautiful. It's a very simple, almost a chant.
Yeah. Close your eyes.
Yeah, and the words are there. So, so Elizabeth Gilbert, Oprah, Brene Brown,
Liz Crocker,
Sandy, Mel Gibson, even Mel Gibson.
Well, Mel Gibson, I do a presentation called, like a keynote called Showing Up, the Transformative Power of Authenticity. And it's in life and in business. But the second slide I have is handwritten that says, or how Mel Gibson helped me show up for Oprah, which is a nice little catchy title. And it's only because when I sat down to interview Mel Gibson, I was doing movie junkets for CTV Atlantic, it was then known as ATV. And I was one of only a handful of Canadians who would be invited on these movie junkets to New York and LA. And I was doing the Mel Gibson one for Braveheart. So he was at the top of his game. He was the star producer and director of that film. And I was walking in the hallway, like I probably wore a bit of a mark in the carpet in the Four Seasons Beverly Hills hallway because I was so nervous. And my friend from Paramount came by and she said, why? What are you doing? You do these movie interviews all the time. And I never would let on that I was nervous, but I always was nervous. But this was unhinged. And I said, it's Mel Gibson. And I felt, I really felt that sense of, I'm just a girl, I'm just an imposter from little Nova Scotia, and I'm pretending to have this confidence. I'm pretending to be Oprah, but I'm not any of these things. And anyway, I went into the room. You only have a couple of seconds while the other person before you, the journalist or the media personality, is leaving. And you have time just to get mic'd, sit down in your chair, and they say, okay, we've got speed, which means tapes are ready, the audio's ready, we can go ahead. And then you only have about 4 minutes. And it's nice if you can create some kind of connection when you first walk in, because for any interview, it's really nice to have some kind of connection before you start. And so he was sitting in this big velvet Braveheart chair, and I had one across from him like this, and I was just walking in, and they said, "Oh, this is Nancy from Nova Scotia." And he said, "Oh, how are you doing?" And for some reason, I've always laughed about it, I told the truth. And I said, "Actually, I'm a little nervous." And that was uncharacteristic of me. And he was so funny and generous in his response. And he said, "Oh my God, you're nervous of talking to me?" And we all know that Mel Gibson has had lots of issues in his life. And I now know, I think he's riddled with insecurities and issues like we all are. And that's what interviewing so many famous people really just led me to the conclusion that we are all the same. It doesn't matter. We may have different amounts of money in our bank account, but we're all the same. And he said, "Okay, look at me in the eyes." And then he started going, and making, just a complete fool of himself. And it was a startling moment, but he brought me right into the present moment, took the helium out of the balloon, like, oh, and then he said, "There, do you feel better?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And all of a sudden, I was just a human being sitting across from a human being. And I took all of that showing off stuff out of the equation. And it helped me because 6 months later is when I traveled to Chicago to interview Oprah. And that was the first big interview I had had where I didn't go into that spiral of, oh my God, what if I make a mistake? And what if I don't do a good enough job? And I'm going to take the tape back and people are going to say, "Oh, she was terrible," And I just sort of showed up.
Yeah, as you have showed up today. And moments, I'm going to turn the energy of the room over also to you to ask questions. But I have a question for you, Nancy, just before we do. So you were in the spotlight for years. And
It's so hard for me to let her ask the questions and not ask any questions. It's so hard. Sorry, Liz.
And for years in that sort of Live at 5 period, you've told me that the light and the public recognition didn't fill your soul at all. And
it lit me up, but just, briefly.
So then you pulled away from that. Now you've written a book that is open and honest and vulnerable and heartfelt and wise, and if I had a thesaurus, I could keep going.
Oh, keep going.
But my point is, you're back in the spotlight.
I know.
How are you navigating that dance?
Well, I'll tell you very openly that I would say from November, maybe even before, for a good period of time before the book went to print and before it came out, but especially before it went to print, it's like my nervous system started going, "What are you doing? What are you doing? This is why? You left the fishbowl. Why do you want to go back into the fishbowl?" And I was not sleeping. I was feeling like my engine was just revving all the time, and I thought it was just all hormones. And a wise osteopath I saw actually dug in right away. He said, how much fear do you have about being public about this? And I said, well, I have to go away and think about it because I have to be honest with myself. And that was a big part of it, because I withdrew partly because I left Live at 5, partly because I had several issues with stalkers. And, sat in a courtroom and there was anyway, it was very serious. And that really scared me to my core, and I had little boys at the time, and I just thought, no, here I am driving home every night, doing 4 right turns before I go on my route, and I thought, no, this doesn't feel right anymore. And so there was part of me, I think, that was triggered by the idea of stepping back into the spotlight. But I will tell you that since the book came out, it feels so different. because, you know, as I was driving down here tonight, I was sort of chuckling, thinking, I always would have been like, oh my gosh, what am I going to say, and how am I going to be, and how is it going to be received, and will there be people there? And there was none of that. There was just, you know what, if it's just Liz and I, we'll have a conversation, it'll be great. And I know all the answers. She's asking me about my own experience, and if I don't know an answer, I can say, well, think about that. So yeah, so can I ask you a question?
Sure.
It was really meaningful to me when you read my book, because I respect you, and I hold your, you know, I think you're intelligent and wise and emotionally intelligent. I know, don't stop, same thing, right? But also, you have a couple of years on me, and I was really curious as to how it would hit you, or how it would land for you. And when you came back after you'd been reading it, and you sent me an email, I think we should have a conversation. Could we have a conversation? And I was like looking at this email like, oh, what does that mean? Like, oh, if she liked it, she'd probably say I really liked it. And then I caught myself, you know, and thought, no, okay, let that go. Doesn't matter. You may hate this book. And then, of course, when we talked, we just opened up a whole level of dialogue we've never had before.
Never.
And it did that for me with Star Cunningham, who used to be Star Dobson, who was the host of Live at 5 after I was. And actually, she interviewed me on my podcast, The Canadian Love Map, and really showed up, because she is the president and CEO of the Mental Health Foundation of Nova Scotia. And she, in that podcast, said more than she ever had before about her own struggles, and talked about the fact that, you know, a year or two ago, she decided, I'm going to put myself in therapy on a regular basis, and I struggle with depression. And so, you know, we had a whole different kind of conversation than ever. And what I'm hearing from people who are reading my book, including demographics I'm not expecting, my younger cousin on the West Coast who's in software, you know, he really, it landed with a thud with him, and he really did his own exploration because of it. So that's really what I'm here for. It's not about, here's my book, ta-da. It's like, let's talk about this, let's converse. But if you were going to describe the book to someone, and you probably have had to do this, if you were going to describe it to someone in an elevator, what would you say? How would you describe it? You got from the ground floor to the 10th floor.
Yeah.
Go.
The book is a story of somebody's life told honestly and occasionally humorously, and it evokes compassion and resonates with me. Hopefully it will resonate with you, I would say to this fictitious person on the elevator. And one of the things that I liked about it, beyond the wholeness of it, was your play with language. And I used to be an English teacher, and I love words, and I love playing with language, and that is an element that you don't often find in a memoir of a difficult story.
Oh, interesting. Thank you.
What floor did we get to?
we're like Charlie in the Chocolate Factory. We went right up through the glass roof. No, thank
Someday
you.
I'll get you to describe transforming memories, but we're not tonight. So questions. This is your time, right at the back. Kelly, I think.
Nancy, I don't know if you can do it from memory, but I'd love if you could recite one of your poems from your book.
Oh, thank you. That was a very vulnerable decision. So I talked about how I pitched. You can tell that I have ADHD. My stories go all over the place. I have a little monkey mind. But I pitched the book about the fear of public speaking. And as they were getting pieces of my writing, my managing editor at Nimbus came and she said, we want to have a conversation about the thrust of your book. we want you to take the fear of public speaking out of it and just make it about fear. And I was like, what? what? No. I said, and I remember that so clearly. I was like, I'm not a psychologist. I can't write a book about fear. She said, no, I want it to be heavy on memoir. It will be, I call it a memoir with a side of self-help, just because I have a section at the end called Doorways to Presence, which are my own tools for bringing myself into the present moment, which is how I stay out of anxiety. And I am a seeker in this book. I'm not a teacher. And that's why I use a lot of teachers' quotes, because I just want to share the path with you. I'm not saying, look at me, I got it all figured out. In fact, that's so not true. And I think very few of us do. You know, I think that it's about the practice of catching ourselves in our old patterns or paradigms. And anyway, so when she eventually got around to saying, I think you should use your poems, because I had shared a few with her, and I was thinking, really? My poems might be considered by some juvenilia. They're very simple, and I feel like my 8-year-old self could have written them, but they are my way of processing. And when 2020, when the lockdown hit, poems started literally pouring through me. It was like I was drinking from a fire hose or something. And I would be doing the dishes and, oh my gosh, a poem's arriving, and a line would come and I'd have to throw off the mitts, don't do many dishes, and go right down, and it would just come out. And what I've found is that, what I believe is that when art of any kind is created from an intellect level, that's where it lands with people. And if it's really created from a heart and soul level, it tends to hit home in that way. And I've had people, I had a woman a couple of weeks ago reach out to show me, makes me emotional, a tattoo she had gotten of a star because of a poem. Can I remember this one? Oh, yeah. Don't love me because I'm special. Don't love what I achieve. Gold stars cause scars and forge the need to please. Love me for who I am in my deepest, darkest heart. A fearful fraud, simply flawed, trying to be smart. See that and see my light, the beauty of my soul. Just like you, trying to get through this journey back to whole. So thank you. But you see what I mean? It's very like, my 8-year-old self might have been able to write that, but not with the wisdom that life brings or the experience that's woven into that. And for me, that's what poetry is is what makes it accessible and so powerful, that, you know, you boil a huge experience down to a few words, and then it can mean different things to different people.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for the question, Kelly. Anybody else as I look past the lights? Really? Yes. Pam.
Hi, thanks Nancy for tonight. Thank you, Liz. And just to dig a little bit on this flawed concept, because I think that it's a word that's very subjective.
Mm-hmm.
And so, how do you know you're flawed? Because, like, it's subjective, and so I find this word a bit confusing, and it's just in our own heads, in my opinion. But you know, there's a flaw in a gem, because there's, you know, like, so there's a physical concept of flawed, but this concept of flawed in terms of who we are, to me, is very subjective. So how do you reconcile that? Yeah.
Well, I love the question, because it allows an explanation from me. That is born of my perfectionist mentality, when I expected myself to be perfect. And I guess what I mean is, we're all flawed, and we're all perfectly imperfect. And if I mean flawed with compassion, And I don't see my flaws as flaws anymore, and that's why I agree with you. So I guess my answer is yes. To take a page out of Liz Gilbert's book. I see myself as happily flawed, and when I make mistakes, I'm very comfortable with that now, and because I don't expect perfection of myself. And so I guess that's what I mean, but I will be thinking about this as I drive home, because I don't want people to take it the wrong way when I say it. I guess for me, I was living as a fraud when I was trying to pretend I didn't have any flaws, and that's all I could see when I looked within, is my own flaws. But now, you're right, in the paradigm I'm living in now, I don't consider them flaws. I consider, it's like, for instance, with my ADHD, I have a couple kids who've also been diagnosed, and I have said to them many times, I would never trade my messy, disorganized mind for a linear, organized mind. Because while for many years I thought it made me not enough, I can't listen to a speech, all the way through without my mind dancing around the room. Now I just understand my mind doesn't work the same as everyone's. It's neuronormative is the expression, I think. I really love my creativity and the way my mind works. Some other people might say, wow, she is, and they might even see that in my book, like that's too much for me. And that's why I started by saying, you may hate this book. So words are subjective.
Yeah.
So what it means to me is not necessarily what it's going to be meaning to you. But I love your question, because it does make me think about the fact that, yeah, I don't mean to say flawed in a judgmental way. I mean in a celebratory way, in a strange manner of speaking. Does that make sense?
Well, that's where I'm sort of going with it, because the thing is that I think it's perfectly perfect.
Right.
Right? Like, how could you be any other way?
Yes, but did you always feel that, or has it taken you a lifetime to arrive there? And I'm not leading the witness. I'm curious.
No. It's a legitimate question. I think that I think over time and through trauma myself, that I came up with the fact that I could not be anybody else but who I am, and so therefore that's perfect.
Hallelujah.
So, but it was through, deep, dark times that I recognized that I couldn't be anything else but that.
Right? And those deep, dark times are an invitation. Like they don't feel like a lovely invitation at the time, but they invite us to that exploration and to that realization.
Well, and I think also that as children, we took on somebody else's idea of what flaws were, and I think that was an injustice that we all face, and for all of the reasons.
I was going to say, well, what you make me think of when you say that is that I'm thinking a lot lately about our education system and the way that we have kids measure themselves according to how far short of perfect they fall. Mm-hmm. And that causes scars. Like, so you're never perfect, and you're supposed to be perfect, but you're always less than perfect. And if our human condition is that so many of us end up feeling less than, it's easy to look back and go, oh yeah, this might have done that, and this, yeah. So I can definitely create a list of things. For me, my grade 4 teacher didn't help, but that's in the book. Thank you for the question. I love that thoughtful question. Yes. I'm happy to see your face here.
It's good to be here. You look wonderful. My question to you is, could you walk us through one of your processes of being present? It's one thing to read about it in a book, but I'm all about experiencing. So if someone were to have the racing mind or going through their imposter moment, could you walk us through a practice that you have to bring us back to the presence? present moment.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad to do that. In fact, I'll give you two if you don't mind, because one I had to use a lot myself when I was in that anxiety state before my book came out, and I'm really thankful that's knock on wood in the past. But I realized one day when I was at the cottage, and usually I'm very relaxed and calm there. It's where most of my writing got done. But my heart just was racing, and it might have been palpitations from menopause, who knows, but I just couldn't get it to settle down, and it was like pounding out of my chest. And I thought, what if I actually dance to the beat of my heart? And my heart was like, and so I just started, no music on, but I was just literally started moving my body and dancing to it. And I went from my sympathetic nervous system straight into my parasympathetic, because it made me laugh to do it, and it just took the air out of the balloon, as I say. So that's something I do a lot, and when I told Star Cunningham that, she said, I've seen you do that backstage. I didn't know what you were doing. You were often like, right before I go up to MC. I say that's because I'm going, and another different kind of one that I offer, a doorway to presence for me, is on the beach. So I love being by the ocean, and the ocean is full of metaphors for me. But one day I picked up a stone, a beach stone that was about this big, pretty rounded, and I started tossing it in the air. And if you've ever done a kettlebell class, you know the kettlebell, it's heavy, you hold it by the handle, but you swing it up and it goes down, and you swing it up and you do different things with it. But I thought, I'm gonna try that with this rock. So I would swing it up, and then I tossed it in the air, and I was catching it, and then I was like, oh, okay, I'm gonna toss it up and throw it up into the air and catch it with the other hand and take it down, swing it back up, catch it with this hand. And I walk along the beach doing that, and you cannot not be present when you're doing that. And so that's just, the Doorways to Presence section is just my own toolbox for bringing myself back into the present moment, because my anxious mind wants to be in the past, ruminating, or in the future, worrying about things that might happen. And in this world right now, that's a natural state for many of us. So it's just about bringing me right into this moment where I know everything's okay right now. It's okay. Calm down.
Great question, thanks for that. I'm looking around. So I'm going to, I was going to say bring this to a close, but that doesn't sound like the right language. I'm going
the end of my book is to be continued.
I was going to say, I'm going to create a transition for you to have a chance to chat with Nancy, get her book if you want. But because you just mentioned the state of the world, this is the transition I want to make. Nancy starts her book not with, you may hate this book. She actually starts it with another quote by Rumi, which is one of my all-time favorites. And the first line of it is, out beyond wrong.
I can say the whole thing if you want.
Yeah.
Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I will meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. Thoughts, ideas, even the phrase each other doesn't make any sense. And that's, it's Rumi, so there are different translations, but that's the gist of it, that beyond this idea of right and wrong, there's a field where we don't judge each other, we don't compare ourselves to each other, and we,
And I think, talking about the state of the world right now, I think one of the reasons why I love that is that it invites me to still be hopeful that we can all get to that field where we don't judge each other. So the transition, to give you the last word, is, given the state of the world, given your marvelous book, do you have any words of encouragement for us?
Well, interesting. I think I would say what I say to teenagers when I do workshops on confidence with them. And that is go and change the world. And they'll often chuckle like, oh yeah. But I just think every one of us can change the world in our own way. And even if it's just being kind to someone who is having a bad day and might be met with resistance or annoyance by someone else, and just being willing to step out of your ego and be patient and kind and compassionate, I think that changes the world a little bit. So yeah.
And as you're going out, nudge up your dimmer switch a little bit and realize you're in the light.
Yeah. Can I say though, I really, before you close, I really want to say thank you so much. I am in this surreal moment in the past few weeks where, I've written a book, and you think if you write a book, you expect people to read it, but you're not really thinking about that. And you're writing from your heart and soul, and you're putting it, and that's why I think I started going to fear when I was like, oh my God, people are really gonna read this. And now it's kind of taking my breath away that people are spending their money buying my book, but then also spending their time, which is more valuable, and hours reading what I've written. So that's, it's really moving. And this is not meant to be self-promotion, but Maritimers put my book on the national bestseller list within 2 weeks of it coming out. And that just floored me. But that's more about I'm sure that's more about the power of television. But I think that I did an interview before the book came out on CTV, and it resonated. People were like, oh yeah, I want to talk about this.
Well,
So
I will say the book is worthy, and you are worthy, and thank you.
Thank you. We are all worthy. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.